Okay, couple housekeeping things before we get going this week. A lot of you are doing excellent with the document analysis worksheets. Um, some of you are still struggling. If you are getting below an 8, make sure that you are reading my comments on those. Sometimes I put them in the grade feedback place. Sometimes they'll actually be in the document themselves. Um, the whole purpose of those, there's two purposes. One is to see that you can um, analyze information and that you can incorporate and put that information into the context. The context being the overall class in this situation. You've got a small little window with a document analysis, but you've got this great big umbrella of everything we've looked at for the week. If you are really struggling with those, make sure that you are looking at all the key terms, like what's sitting here on your screen right now. Those are the key things that you need to be relating those document analysis worksheets to and the primary source to say, okay, how does this fit into the overall context of what we've looked at this week? It does one of a couple things. I can see that you can analyze them. The other thing that it does is allows me to make sure that you have completed the entire module. My question is whenever you were giving me these very brief overviews in that last section, which is basically a summary of the document, which a lot of you were doing, and that's not what I want you to do there. The summary kind of goes up in that that why was this written kind of thing. Um, the how does it relate to class part should not be a summary at all. I mean, you can use quotes in there to help you relate it to the things in the class. But you should be looking back at the big umbrella terms. For example, with the week, I think it was week 6, very few of you related that to the taxation and to the virtual representation and to those big hub terms. So make sure you're doing that or you're not going to get all the points on those. So I've got to see that you are, well, sorry, I forgot to turn my ringer off on my phone. I've got to see that you are connecting back to the overall theme for the class. So with that being said, this week your document analysis, you will be turning in for the base of your paper. You have a paper due for me in a couple weeks. I'm going to actually push that paper date back. I think it showed like the end of October. I'm not ready for you to turn those in yet, and I don't think you're ready for them to turn them in. But this week's document analysis that you turn in will end up turning into a much larger paper, your term paper for this semester. So I'll walk you straight through that, but for now, all you need to worry about is completing the document analysis worksheets. I will put up further instructions for how to create the paper next week. All your rubrics, that kind of stuff, things that I'll be looking at there. That'll go up next week. But this week, just try to really fill that last section in. I mean, if you're doing those right, they should be about 2 pages long. Just being real. I know that seems like a lot for a 10-point assignment, but 10 points over the course of a semester when you've got these due every week, except for, on exam weeks, those points really truly do add up. So they should be significant in size if you are doing them correctly. All right, so let's look at creating a new nation. Now, I have put up information about the U.S. Constitution. That is part of your assignment for this week. You need to read that. You need to be familiar with it. And I've also put up like an outline of some questions that you need to ask yourself as you're reading those. Just to, you'll kind of see it maybe on an exam or something like that, but make sure you're paying attention to those things. And the key that you need to be thinking about whenever you're reading the U.S. Constitution was, why was the Articles of Confederation not enough? Why did they feel that they needed to go back and redo that and do something different there? So be thinking about those kind of things. So you will be looking at the Constitution. You will have your base for your primary source paper due this week, which is just your document analysis worksheet. It is not anything extra or anything new. You will have your normal discussion board forum. Probably not as many videos this week because I am going to put up your study guide for your exam next week. Now, I do want to touch on that. Your exam next week is 100 points. Your last one was 75 points, which means this exam is a little bit bigger. There will be an additional element of some multiple choice and some matching on this one. I will still give you about an hour and 30 minutes on this. I did not mean to give you 2 hours last time on the last exam. That was entirely too much. My kids, in class, they're taking the same size of stuff in about 50 minutes. So you'll have roughly an hour and a half, just because I know that it is a little more complicated whenever you are sitting in front of a computer and doing these things. So, but it will be significantly bigger than what you saw on your last exam. So you will be given 4 essays to look at on your study aid guide, and then of course I'll ask you 2. And there will be the multiple choice element, and there will be the matching element. So if you've got any questions on those, give me a shout. So I completely encourage you guys, if any of you know each other, get together and study for this exam. So the more you know in your head before you sit down to take it, the quicker this will go, and the better that it will be. So, all right. So let's look at conflict in the new nation. So new nations don't just pop up overnight. I know we like to kind of think that, ooh, boom, United States declared independence and everything was hunky-dory and good to go. But there are some problems and some internal conflict which happens in the new nation. So, and the Constitution is one aspect of creating a unique American culture. A unique American culture did not happen overnight, and there's a few reasons for that. So if we look at what culture is, to define culture can be pretty tricky. The encyclopedic definition is the sum total of all contributions of a group of people in a designated area within a given time. It represents more specifically the aesthetic or intellectual achievements or appreciation of an individual or a society, and also the lifestyle of society as passed on from generation to generation. Now, if you think back about what you know about the colonies, you know that that's going to be a problem. The colonies did not have those shared experiences, those shared beliefs, those shared customs. They certainly didn't have shared religion or music or humanities. Many of them are not going to have a shared material possessions or interactions. A lot of them did not work the same. Some of their literature is going to be familiar, just because if you look at what leads up to declaring independence, they have kind of viewed the same things. They do have a shared language, which is a good thing. But primarily, if you look at the things they shared, goes back to them being British. So how do they come together and create all these things together in an experimental country? Because keep in mind, a republic isn't really, it's not very common, and it is very experimental. Americans, unshackle your minds and act like independent beings. You have been children long enough, subject to the control and subservient to the interests of a haughty parent. You have now an interest of your own to augment and defend. You have an empire to raise and support by your exertions, and a national character to establish and extend by your wisdom and virtues. Americans must believe and act from the belief that it is dishonorable to waste life in mimicking the follies of other nations and basking in the sunshine of foreign glory. And Noah Webster said this in 1788. Now, Noah Webster is the Webster that you are probably sitting there thinking of, that he did write the Webster Dictionary. If you ever get a chance, it's really cool. EKU's library has one of the original dictionaries, Noah Webster's dictionaries, and it is a really neat thing to see. They'll put it out on display sometimes, so check that out if you ever happen to walk through the library and see it on display. But Webster's really, really warning the new United States to not mimic what the British people are doing. Not mimic the French, not mimic anything else, but to create their own thing. We tend to have this idea that cultural wars are a modern problem. We take for granted that the founders of the United States knew what kind of government needed to be established and simply wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And we take for granted that while they were wise, they they may not have known exactly how this thing could work, and there were all kinds of ideas. So I want you to think right now, if you were to create your own country, what factors would you need to think about to create unification of the people? Because if you don't have the unification of the people, how do you create a new country? So, what would you do? How would you create law-abiding citizens and culturally in a culturally unique society if you don't want to mimic other countries? Would you incorporate elements of the old culture that you knew, and how would you overcome those differences in opinion? How do you learn something entirely new and then enforce it to an entire population of people who have been so separated from one another? Um, and a lot of this is all about perspective. Perspective. The democratic government established was not based on a textbook example. It was an experiment, and there is no shared history among these people. So, what is history, and how do you create a history for a new nation? The editor of a Philadelphia literary magazine said every genuine patriot must earnestly long for an authentic American history. History must do two things. It must be reflected, it must reflect true events and images, and it must be instructive. Okay, so it must be truthful and it must be instructive. And the colonies had simply too many histories, and it was too limited. Remember, I told you at the beginning of the semester when we started setting up these colonies, don't try to join them together in your head. They have to be put in their own space, in their own time. Because if you put them all together, then you get this mixed up notion that they were all established for religious reasons, or that they were all established for economic reasons. You have to keep them individual in your head, because I tell you what, Jamestown may have been religious, but they weren't the same kind of religion that you see in Plymouth. These people have too many different histories. So they kind of have to create something that kind of pulls them all together. Localized histories, if you look around at localized histories, I mean, we have some historians here in Madison County that's all they do is localized history. Our localized history is not the same as Fayette County's localized history, which is not the same as Jefferson's Jefferson's localized history. So it's just simply too big. And so they have to look at this in a way of how do we create a unique history. A lot of means of consolidating a new national identity were failing, and that there were hopes of a history of the United States, in that history would solve that problem. So we see a couple different people come up. One of these I want you to write down. His name is David Ramsay. David Ramsay was from South Carolina. He was a statesman, a physician, and he wrote 2 histories of South Carolina, and he wrote a history of the American Revolution. And this thing was 12 volumes. Now, you guys, most of you hate doing the reading for this class anyways, I'm sure. And it's a pretty small little book that you have. Can you imagine trying to get 12 volumes? I mean, reading 12 volumes to figure out the history of this. It's just too much. And he did finally get to a common root of American history, and that common root was the colonists themselves. And no matter what, each colonist or each colony had colonists, and those colonists were strong, they were independent, they were white, they were male Republicans. And in Ramsay's history, the British were not belittled, but the American people were very unsatisfied with what he wrote. So we will talk about Mercy Otis Warren in the next video.